This is In Hindsight, half a century of research discoveries in Canadian history, presented by Dr. Donald B. Smith and produced by the Ontario Historical Society.
It is a joyous, at the same time, a sad moment. This is the end of In Hindsight. It's been quite a journey. The last episode, number 21, title came to me, Ontario Made Me, Calgary Adopted Me. That pretty well summarizes what's happened in my academic career. I've been so fortunate to really have two homes. So what I'd like to do today, in the last episode, is just review, well, really, particularly my first arrival in Calgary and my introduction to my new home. Will start in mid-August 1974. That really is almost exactly 49 years ago. I came to Calgary on the eve of an anniversary. I didn't know this at the time when I left Toronto, but when I got here, I learned progressively that Calgary was on the verge of an important anniversary. Its 100th anniversary. It had been founded as a police post in 1875, and the city was planning a commemoration of that event. The University of Calgary itself, at this point, if you go back to my episode 1, where I review the department, the founding of it by George Self, the history of it, it now, in 1974, was 8 years old. And the one faculty, the core faculty, was Faculty of Education. This now had expanded to 10 faculties, the last being law, which had just come in that year. So it had become a really substantial university. The university was part of the celebrations, or wanted to be, as well as certainly the Department of History did. In fact, Tony Rasprich and Henry Clausen, my new colleagues in the Department of History, were beginning underway discussions with the Historical Society of Alberta, Chinook Country Chapter, about doing a joint event. They were talking with Dave Coots and Grant Weber, executive people with the Chinook Country Chapter, about doing a conference. That conference would come off in May next year, 1975, and it was a big success. Fortunately, there was a very attractive, well-presented volume brought out by McClellan and Stuart West after the conference, and it was entitled Frontier Calgary, Town, City, and Region. The book itself, very well edited by Tony and Henry, described the transformation in a collection of essays, about 20 essays. They described the transformation of a small prairie town into a cosmopolitan urban center in one generation. In fact, the population jumped from the most dramatic jump was 1900 to about 1901 to 1911, and population doubled 1,000% from 4,000 to 44,000. So this is the story of a community which is just coming into its own, and the various topics discussed in the conference and in the papers cover the whole gamut. This is really new style history for Calgary. This is looking at class, feminine, women's issues, ranching, of course, urban development, city planning, religion. It's covering all aspects. It's really big step forward for Calgary history. And I was there. I just arriving before the conference and was a beneficiary of that volume, giving me good orientation when I arrived here. Now, the old orientation, the old interpretation was quite obvious, because in was all in a mural at the Calgary not International Airport then, but the Calgary Airport in 1974. Actually had the mural. There had been some renovations, however. The mural was taken down, but it was back in 1978 with the new renovation. But it had been in place originally from 1958 on. It is very important, and in the text, accompanying the text, there's an image of it. It's a mural by Don Franch, who's an Alberta artist, and it showed the perception, really, of history at the time. And it's a perception of great men. There are four figures. There's Colonel MacLeod, the Mountie, superintendent of the Mounties. There's Father Lacombe, Catholic missionary, John McDougall, Methodist or United Church missionary, and an unnamed settler, and Crowfoot, the great Blackfoot chief who made Treaty 7. So, but essentially, it's just it's a white man's interpretation of history, and this is the mural. This is really the way it was when I came. The conference would make quite a few differences. Now, there was another appointment in the summer of 1974, in addition to yours truly, and it was a very important figure in Alberta, an extremely important figure. His name was Grant McEwen. He was the real thing. He had just been retired as the lieutenant governor of Alberta. Previously to that, he'd been mayor of Calgary and an important legislature in Edmonton, as well as an agricultural expert, a professor at University of Manitoba. Very distinguished career. Grant loved writing, and he loved history. The university appointed him on his retirement as lieutenant governor. They appointed him a professor, and he would teach a course on the exploration and settlement of the Canadian prairies. So I start with Grant. Quite ridiculous, really, the neophyte and the seasoned gladiator. I read Grant's book that very first winter, early 1975. It was called Calgary Cavalcade, and it was dedicated to the Northwest Mounted Police, who had founded the city of Calgary in 1875. So it's another edition of his original book. It came out in 1958, Calgary Cavalcade, and I read it. Now, Grant was extremely well qualified for this topic of prairie history. He'd lived through the entire prairie experience. He's born in a farm and raised farms in Manitoba and then Saskatchewan. He'd gone on to university, graduate training in agriculture. He went to the Ontario Agricultural College in Guelph and then University of Iowa. He was an agricultural specialist. That was his real field. However, he loved history. And from an early age at the university, he gave public talks and wrote really with tremendous energy about prairie history. He had a great style, interesting anecdotes, great power of description, because he knew the land so well. Well, Grant felt this history file was important. There was an urgency to it. He wanted the past to be known. He explained to his son-in-law, Max Foran, his daughter, Heather, married an Australian, Max, who was a teacher, very experienced teacher, who came after they married. They married here in Calgary after meeting in Australia, and Max came and began his teaching career here in 1964. Well, Grant, very close to Max, and he told him that, in his opinion, nothing was being done to record the pioneers' stories, and that's why he explained his intense interest. Now, Max actually was so close that he did a fair bit of writing about his father-in-law, and that really helps us with any appreciation of him. Well, I'd just like to push it a little further because it's such a contrast. Grant's style was so popular. He was an extremely successful prairie author. His bestseller in Calgary was a wonderful book called Eye Opener Bob. It had come out about, late 1957. It had done extremely well. The Calgary Albertan newspaper published a particularly warm review. one which captured exactly what Grant had tried to do. It stated, "Old-time Calgarians will lose 40 years while they are strolling through this book. For them it is a privilege. The younger generation and the newcomers have a duty to read it, for only thus will they know that 8th Avenue is hallowed ground." That's the main commercial street in Calgary, in the old city. Grant arrived, he was the Dean of Agriculture, Manitoba, a very senior academic. He arrived in Calgary in 1951, and this energetic individual quickly became involved in community activities, winning a seat on City Council in 1953, then election to the provincial legislature in 1955. The 1955s were a decade in which Calgary changed enormously. I've touched a bit on this in episode 1 on George South. Grant arrived at a time when the huge influx of newcomers during the city's oil and gas boom pushed aside tales of early Calgary. He arrived just in time to record stories soon to disappear. Always must in history appreciate the context. Grant arrives, there is no Glenbow Archives and Library. That wonderful repository of Western Canadian history only began in 1956. Well, Grant was as productive as ever, even with his political career. And he shows, though, how docile he was. 3 of his books in the early, from 1969 on, 3 of his books were touching upon Indigenous issues. Portraits of the Plains, 1971, was on First Nations. Métis Makers of History, 1980, was on the Métis. And he did a very popular biography of Tatangamani, or Walking Buffalo, a Stoney Nakoda chief. That came out in 1969. So he started off originally, was very white-centric. His book, The Sodbusters, for example, 1948, is dedicated to the individual farmers, the pioneers who opened up the prairies. Not too much attention given to natives. Now it's totally different. It's total coverage. Max Foran helped his father-in-law with his last publication, and Grant kept going right to the end. He kept going to a few weeks before his death. His book, Watershed, Reflections on Water, is very concerned about the whole question of abundant water in the West for farming and for the human population and for livestock and all. He published his book, Reflections on Water, and it came out just a few months after his death. And Max, his son-in-law, was instrumental in guiding that one through. And Max, just so close to him. I'd like to say a few words about Max, and we'll get back to the the story of my time here. And I'd like to just say that Max, through his father-in-law, well, he's an Australian, but he's a very gifted writer, and he a teacher, mind you, and he's a principal of a school. But he found time for history, thanks to his wife, Heather, and his 2 daughters, very supportive. Max's major book, Calgary, An Illustrated History, came out in 1978. That's 4 years after I've been here. He was well-argued, superbly researched, and the product of his graduate studies at the University of Calgary. He did his master's and his PhD. He was a first PhD from the Department of History, University of Calgary, and he's done us proud. So Max, then, a friend, Hugh Dempsey was a part of a trio, and we'd often go get together and for years, for decades, and really was really great, very supportive. Now, back to my arrival. I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story. Back to my arrival at the University of Calgary. I'd arrived once again in mid-August of 1974. I was lucky because the new social science building had just been built, and I ended up on the sunny side. I had a glimpse of the Rockies. On the other side, you didn't have a totally uninspiring view, but I had a glimpse of the Rockies. I just landed at the right time. And, this is when I met George Self. He was still teaching for another 2 years. And I just found it a very, very good environment. I should add, just by the way, just to give you a sign of the times, everything is context. In the office, on the desk, waiting for me, was an ashtray. That's the sign of the times. Unbelievable. Smoking still all over the place. I didn't smoke, gosh, but I saved that ashtray. And when I retired in 2009, I gave it to a new colleague, to keep the tradition alive of this object that was just a sign of the times of the mid-1970s. Well, life for me after 1974 in the university setting was just perfect. I mean, honestly, I couldn't believe it. Pinch me, I'm dreaming. I was being paid to do my hobby, Canadian history. Had great neighbors. On one side was Marion McKenna. She was an American historian, did her PhD at Columbia. She had studied, couldn't believe this, under Alan Nevins. Alan Nevins was a very celebrated American historian, taught for years at Columbia. Marion she was the first woman in the department. That's how it was all male dominated until Marion arrived, and quickly became full professor. The book that had so impressed me about Nevins was Gateway to History, which is a guide to various styles of writing history, done first in the late 30s, but brought out again in 1962. And I had read that as an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. I'm very impressed by it. And I like very much that many, many details, just wonderful. The importance of good writing. That's what he emphasized, as well as research. Very, very strong on that. So Marion was a great, very supportive, very friendly, and helped with American aspects of research questions. Really delightful person, and so pleased that she was on one side of my office. On the other side was Frank Ike. And Frank was a very, very good colleague. He was very British. In fact, just knowing him, you got a sense of fair play, and he was unfailingly courteous. He'd been educated at St. Paul's public school. That means private school in Britain, a very distinguished school. And he'd gone on to Oxford, where he studied European history. Now, at first, I was dealing here with, my neighbor was the quintessential English gentleman, I thought, scholar. Appearances can be deceiving. Frank was really not English at all. He was born in Germany. He'd been sent by his parents to England at age 12 in 1935. His family was German Jewish. And Frank then had come to England at age 12. He'd gone to public school at Oxford, served in the British Army in World War II. His family was later able to get to Britain. I shouldn't say later, but in the late 30s, able to get to Britain. But Frank grew up and learned his new culture, a very strange culture. He learned it so well he could explain it to me. In fact, he and his wife Rosemary were very close friends right to the end. Frank passed away in the early. Up until his passing, he was an extremely good friend and very, very strong memories of it. Other good friends included, really probably essential to my work, because I've been taught, I was appointed to teach Canadian history, yes, with specialization in First Nations, or Indians as they were called then, and history of Quebec. As it turned out, history of Quebec, I continued to do that for 35 years. I also had a course in Quebec, but the one that grew, that just took off, was that on the Indigenous peoples. It just was sensational. And the gentleman who helped me great deal was Ian Getty. Ian, I interviewed in February of 1974, earlier 74, and Ian had been very friendly. We corresponded, and then finally I'm in Calgary and spent the first night in a seedy hotel, and Ian said, "Come and stay at my place." He had a little house, and I bunked in with him for a week until I got accommodation in an apartment. I got a room in an apartment, Trywood Plaza. I used to call it Plywood Plaza, but it wasn't. That's mean, because it was a good place. In any case, Ian was a very good friend, and right from the beginning. Others good friends included Howard and Tamara Palmer, and they really were good. They were having me over Thanksgiving and whatnot regularly, and really made me feel at home. Howard's expertise was ethnic studies, and he was a pioneer in the field, very highly regarded Soon he got me involved in Canadian Ethnic Studies, the magazine, and Henry Claassen, my good friend, another Canadian historian, the one that had with Tony had been so instrumental in organizing the conference. Henry got me in the Chinook country chapter, so I became quite at ease very quickly. Now, Hugh Dempsey, very important, and I talk about Hugh. He's the subject of one episode, so need not stay with that topic. He just instrumental, did so much for me. So my understanding of Indigenous peoples, I owe so much to him, as Ian, of course, and to others I would meet in that early years. Some students and a gentleman that Hugh introduced me to, particularly was helpful. That was Mike Eaglespeaker. Now, when I got to Calgary, and I explained this in episode on Longlands, episode 4, I became enthralled with his story of this American classified as colored who had some Indigenous ancestry and looked Indigenous to non-Indigenous people who had come to Canada, said he was a Cherokee, but in actual fact, all of this was quite constructed. He was very, very popular in Alberta, as the chapter episode 4 explains, and a very good writer and all, and visited the Bloods, or Kainai, a number of times, and there he met and befriended a young gentleman named Mike Eaglespeaker. Mike was the first Blood to go off the reservation for education. He went to the Claresholm Agricultural School, and Longlands encouraged him. Mike really was. He'd been to residential school, but he'd learned a great deal about his culture because he'd only gone to that school, the residential school, St. Paul's, at the age of 10. Before that, he learned a great deal about the Blood's history and ancient customs. His father, Eaglespeaker, had served as a young man in raids against the Cree. And he knew the culture, and he also had the knowledge of English, so he could communicate. And Longlands encouraged him. Many images of Mike remain fresh in my mind because I met him several times. I remember the time he demonstrated sign language and told stories about Nape to my history class at the university just in my beginning in the mid 1970s. The proud look on his face, I remember that when he watched his family and friends dancing in their traditional costumes at Blood Indian days. But above all, one picture remains in my mind of Mike. It was in the late fall of 1977. Mike, his wife, and I, and their grandson Dwayne, went down to the old agency where the St. Paul's School once stood, the residential school. We slowly walked around, seeing the sites of the old buildings where the boys and girls' residence were, where the school and the barns once stood. Then we visited the old cemetery and saw the graves, tombstones of former students of St. Paul's. When returning to the car, I turned and looked back. Mike was still standing by the cemetery. I heard him giving a prayer in Blackfoot. It's that image that is left with me. Mike's prayer was given with great emotion. That's the image that's left with me. Mike Eaglespeaker was a kind, considerate man who bridged both cultures, but who never left his own. Now that I had ample time, money, and encouragement from colleagues, I could go full blast on my existing research interest on Grey Owl, who I've talked about in episode 3. John Tutusis, a Plains Cree, was his brother, adopted brother. I discovered that, and now I'm out in the West. I was able to visit John and went out to Poundmaker Reserve in Saskatchewan and visited John. We became good friends because he was indeed Grey Owl's brother. They adopted each other. They met and adopted each other. John, he really wasn't convinced that Grey Owl was Indian, but he admired what he was doing with the animals. He was on their side, and saw great merit in his efforts to prevent the decimation of the beaver. So they got along and respected each other. And I got along with John. In fact, he visited Calgary on two occasions, lengthy visits, and stayed at my place. John shared with me his outlook and made it quite clear he wanted to make the First Nations self-reliant and self-supporting. He had absolutely no use for the Indian Act, which had not talked about at all when the treaty, he was in the Treaty 6 area, was discussed. The treaty should have been the importance, not the idea of equality and just reciprocity. Instead, it was this Indian Act, this draconian act of 1877 that was applied. John objected to this. I really, again, probably the most vivid memory that I have of my visits was the last one in May 1984. John visited and stayed at my place. I married Nancy Townsend at that point, and he stayed with us for a couple of days, and he was so excited. I wrote in my diary. He came again in mid-November 1984, and I wrote in my diary, John's very enthusiastic about self-government, told me again about San Marino. He had a copy of their treaty with Italy. San Marino is a tawny enclave in Italy, which has control over its own domestic affairs, and Italy looks after defense and foreign affairs. In short, it's really self-governing within Italy. John thought this was a great model, and he loved the way San Marino could make its own laws, and he wanted this for the Plains Cree. He wanted this for the First Nations. He wanted them to return, the First Nations to be able to return to old customs. He had worked for, my diary says, he has worked for this for 50 years. Well, John was a great influence. Mike Eagle Speaker, John, and other First Nations people that I had the privilege of meeting. Worthy of note, a humorous note, is the letter John sent me on September 17th, 1983. Of course, I saved it. It's so good. John begins, "How are you, Chief Redcap? Since you are my chief, I have to use your Cree name. Hope everything is going good. I earned my title for being John's train station porter, a redcap." Oh, John had a marvelous sense of humor. Well, eventually my biographies of Longlands, Grey Owl, and a third extraordinary character, Ontario-born Will Jackson, or Henri Jackson, who became Riel's secretary in 1884-85, all three books came out. I called it my trilogy of three prairie visionaries. Longlands came out in 1982, Grey Owl 1990, and Henri Jackson in 2007. I found these people all intriguing. They all had colorful stories about their past, but they all contributed something far more than many, many others. They were visionaries. Okay, I worked then on the Prairie Trilogy. I also kept up with my Mississauga work. Now, there again, go to the episodes 5 to 8. They're about the Mississauga, the First Nations people, the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe on the North Shore of Lake Ontario. And my PhD thesis had been on that topic. And I continued on. I must thank my wife, Nancy Townsend. We married in 1982. And my two sons, David and Peter Smith, who helped so much to make my first book on the Mississauga, well, certainly the second one. They were a bit young for helping with Mississauga, with the first book, Sacred Feathers, which is a biography of Peter Jones, the central figure, chief and Methodist preacher in the mid-19th century. That they were not able to help much with, but they did with the second book, which was called Mississauga Portraits. They helped me because the digital revolution had begun. They helped me with innumerable technological issues. And as long as they were with me, I was invincible. But then, of course, they grow up, go away. I'm on my own. One happy consequence of working so long on Mississauga Portraits, which came out in 2013, was the digitalization revolution of the early 21st century. I benefited greatly from new research tools. Many articles from 19th century North American and British newspapers now became available on the web. With these new search engines, I could locate many new sources. I still remained very rusty, though, and needed help. But however, with my sons gone, I was cobbled together a help team, and the university was great. So I got through it. One important development was a conference that Ian Getty and I organized in 1977 that was entitled One Century Later. It was the 100th anniversary of Treaty 7, the treaty by which for Southern Alberta. And Ian and I organized a conference in mid-February that year. Lieutenant Governor Steinhauer opened our conference. It was an incredible success. I wrote back to my mother in Oakville in late February 1977. We had over 400 at the opening session, 300 full delegates, and 500 at the banquet. At the head table, I sat beside the Lieutenant Governor himself. It was thanks to Ian's doing that the Indigenous people participated so fully as they did. 1/3 of our delegates were Indigenous. I'd like to, just on this personal level, tell you about the guest speaker, Harold Cardinal. And Harold Cardinal, in Seen But Not Seen, my most important book, is featured in in the Alberta chapter, so more can be found there. But in a nutshell, Harold Cardinal was a very competent, courageous First Nations leader, very young, in his mid-20s, who had written a book, The Unjust Society, and spoke back and argued for the recognition of the treaties and the respect of the First Nations people. He was our keynote speaker. And I just include this because it's great to be humble, and I'm certainly humble. I was in charge of the banquet. Here I am beside the Lieutenant Governor. Harold's on the other side. And gosh, well, we're in this, well, we have 500 people. It's in the convention center. Actually, 2 blocks away from that crummy hotel I stayed in, the King George, later the Carlton, which had been torn down in 1977. Well, I guess it was still standing at the time of our conference. We'll forget that. It's on the side. In any case, there's 500 people before me, and Harold's beside me, and people are sitting down, and Harold's getting really nervous, and I'm uncomfortable. I mean, this is a big job for me. I'm just a foot soldier, and here I am with the Lieutenant Governor on one side and Harold's on the other, and Harold's getting really nervous. So I was really getting sort of freaking out. Well, then Harold said, "Aren't you going to have a grace?" And I'd forgotten totally. Now, fortunately, Albert Lightning, a Cree elder, was seated just below in the amongst the, we were at the head table, and just below us, visibly, very close to us, was Albert Lightning. And I didn't know Albert. I probably met him once or twice, but I just jumped out of my seat, ran over and said, "Albert, will you please give him a grace?" And he did, thank heavens. So we covered that one. I missed that bullet. But then I'm back at the head table, and Harold's, okay, but now suddenly nervous again. I didn't know what to do. When people are sitting down and all, and Harold says, "Don, aren't you going to have a toast to the Queen?" And I'm telling you, the respect for the First Nations, because the treaties were with the Crown, is so high. So no, I hadn't even thought of that one. But up I go, and a toast to the Queen. Well, thank heavens, after that, it was all clear sailing. I could relax. Now, getting near the end of this story of my early adventures in Alberta, my second home, I'd like to describe the arrival of another colleague in Canadian history, Doug Francis. He'd known Howard quite well at York University and done his PhD work there. Doug came to Calgary in 1976. And Doug and I got quite chummy, a lot of similarities. He was a great teacher. I suggested, he certainly came beside me on this one, the need for a reader, because our students, there's 300 to 400 students in Canadian survey courses, and there's no books. I mean, there are books, but they're on reserve, and there's not enough. So we decided to propose a reader. And fortunately, the publisher, Holt Reinhardt and Winston, accepted the proposal and brought out our selections, 7 editions of them, for 2 volumes, one before Confederation, pre-1867 and one post-1867. These two readers were phenomenally successful. 7 editions from 1982 to 2009, and Doug and I were companions in arms on those. Well, these were successful, so what a good idea to have a textbook to go along with them. So we started work on that, and we pulled in a friend of mine from Laval days. Go to episode 2, Richard Jones. And Richard became part of the trio. He did Quebec and the Modern Times, and it just was a great team. The book came out. The books would be published and in late 1980s, first edition, and continued to 2010. We did 6 editions of 2-volume History of Canada. The titles are Origins and Destinies. Barbara Grant, Doug's wife, organized a wonderful book launch for us at the Wainwright Hotel at Heritage Park when the first editions came out of Origins and Destinies. Very, very clear memories of that wonderful afternoon. Well, now, lots else, time's short. I retired in 2009, but really didn't retire. Well, not really, because the only difference was there was no teaching, which I missed, and there was no marking, which I was ecstatic about. That's the curse of teaching, the marking. Well, I could go full out on my writings again. And, Mississauga Portraits was in 2013, and that's a post-retirement book. And then there was a second, because I had something still in me. And it is by... well, what do we say? Meisterwork, my major book, Seen but Not Seen, Influential Canadians and the First Nations from the 1840s to today. It's really, I gave it everything I could. I love biography as it humanizes the past. In Seen but Not Seen, I explore in chronological order the ideas and life stories of 16 influential Canadians. I selected these individuals to narrate the history of Indigenous peoples' marginalization. I'd made this study in order to understand myself why non-Indigenous Canadians failed to recognize Indigenous societies and cultures as worthy of respect. This interest in the topic extended back to my MA days at Laval and my PhD at the University of Toronto. Okay. In 1971, now this ties it to Ontario and Quebec. Quebec's important to me, but it's really, in my story, it's Ontario and Alberta. In 1971, I'm still resident of Ontario, I published my first academic article in Canadian history in Ontario History, the Journal of the Ontario Historical Society. My ties with the Ontario Historical Society remain close ever since. Indeed, Rob Leverty, then the executive director at the Ontario Historical Society, wanted to host the Toronto book launch of Seen but Not Seen in the Ontario Historical Society's historic Mackenzie House in Willowdale in North York, north of Toronto. But the one historical truth that all members of our noble profession all solemnly accept intervened. And that is simple. You cannot predict the future. The outbreak of the horrible COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, less than a year before the publication of the book, totally obliterated the plan of a book launch at the Ontario Historical Society headquarters. During the late summer of 2021, with COVID still very much at large, Rob Leverty and I began to discuss a follow-up to Seen but Not Seen. Within a few months, a new one had taken shape. A limited series podcast consisting of sketches of approximately 20 historical figures in Canada whom I had researched in depth over half a century. The weekly series, in Hindsight, follows the model of old-fashioned radio in its relaxed, accessible focus on different personalities in 19th and 20th century Canadian history. Wearing a set of headphones, just as I am at this very moment, wearing a set of headphones in Calgary under the extremely capable direction of Ontario Historical Society project manager and librarian Sarah McCabe, I began recording weekly episodes in January 2023. The accompanying written reports for each episode took several days each to compose, Please note there's an oral recording and there always is a text with each of the episodes. The regular series ended, or will end, with this episode. Episode 21. It's the final wrap-up. It's been quite a journey. Very hard to conclude. I think just one statement. All my academic life, I've benefited from my two homes, Ontario and Alberta. Ontario made me, Calgary adopted me. The end of episode 21. It's been quite a journey.